Jake had been in the neighborhood for just over 3 months, enjoying the slower pace of retirement. After decades as a firefighter, he'd finally given himself permission to spend time on his favorite passion, his Harley-Davidson. The bike wasn't just transportation. It was a piece of his life, restored bolt by bolt over years of late-night tinkering in the garage. Every weekend, he'd roll it out into the driveway, polish the chrome until it shone like a mirror, and take it for a leisurely ride down winding back roads. One Tuesday morning, just as he was sipping his first cup of coffee, there was a sharp knock at the door. Standing there was a woman in her mid-50s with perfectly styled hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Karen, the HOA president and neighborhood liaison. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped onto his porch, glanced past him into the house, and got straight to her point. "I've noticed you've got a fatto Harley parked in your garage," she said, her tone dripping with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "My son Tyler just graduated from community college. He needs a dependable ride to get to his new job, and your bike would be perfect for him." Jake almost laughed, thinking she was joking. "Ma'am, that Harley is mine. I've had it for years. I'm not selling it, if that's what you're asking." Her eyes narrowed. "Oh no, I'm not talking about buying. I'm talking about helping your community. It's just sitting there most of the time. Tyler's a responsible young man. You could simply sign it over. Think of it as a generous gesture. You're new here, after all." Jake set his coffee down, unsure if he was hearing her correctly. "You want me to give my Harley to your son?" "That's not going to happen." Karen's smile vanished completely. "If you're not willing to work with me, I have other ways to handle this. The HOA has certain powers regarding vehicle use and property aesthetics. I'd hate to see you start off here on the wrong foot." Jake leaned against the doorframe, meeting her glare with a steady look. "Good luck with that." She spun on her heel and walked away, muttering something under her breath. Jake closed the door, shaking his head. He figured that was the end of it, but in reality, it was just the beginning of something far uglier. 2 days after the strange encounter, Jake found an envelope tucked under his front doormat. Inside was a neatly typed letter on HOA letterhead, stating he was in violation of neighborhood noise regulations due to excessive motorcycle revving. The date listed was the same day he'd been in his backyard grilling, nowhere near his bike. Jake shrugged it off as a coincidence until another envelope appeared the following morning. This one claimed his garage was being used for unauthorized storage and that non-compliant vehicles were visible from the street. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. Every couple of days, a new letter arrived, each more absurd than the last. Improper grass height, obstruction of curb visibility, unauthorized parking in the driveway. Jake began keeping the letters in a folder, knowing instinctively he might need them later. The signature at the bottom was always the same, Karen, in her bold, looping handwriting. Then came the night he spotted a shadow at the end of his driveway. It was Karen, holding her phone up, snapping photos of his garage. She didn't notice him at first, but when he stepped into the porch light, she froze. "Just documenting community violations," she said coolly before striding off into the darkness. The following week, Jake returned from a short ride to find a tow truck idling in front of his house. The driver looked uncomfortable when Jake pulled into the driveway. "Lady from the HOA called, said this bike's abandoned property and needs to be removed," the man explained, jerking his head toward Karen, who was standing smugly on the sidewalk. Jake's voice was calm but firm. "This is my motorcycle. It's registered, insured, and very much not abandoned. You're not taking it anywhere." He handed the driver his paperwork, and after a quick glance, the man shook his head, muttered something about a mix-up, and left. Karen didn't back down. Instead, she began talking loudly to a small group of neighbors the next day, claiming Jake was unstable and harassing her. The final straw came that Friday morning when Jake saw two police officers walking up his path. Karen was standing at the curb, arms folded, telling them the bike belonged to her son and that Jake was refusing to return stolen property. It was no longer petty HOA harassment, it was a direct attack. And Jake decided it was time to end this game. The two officers approached Jake's porch with the measured professionalism of people who had been told one thing but weren't entirely convinced it was true. Jake stepped outside before they could knock, holding his hands loosely at his sides. "Morning, sir," one of them began. "We received a report about a stolen motorcycle. A woman named Karen claims the bike in your garage belongs to her son." Jake almost laughed, but instead, he kept his voice even. "That Harley is mine. I've owned it for years. I have all the paperwork to prove it." He turned, walked into the house, and returned moments later with a manila folder. Inside was the title, the bill of sale, insurance documents, and even photographs of him working on the bike over the years. The officers flipped through the pages, nodding. "Everything looks in order here," one said, clearly ready to wrap things up, until a shrill voice cut through the air. Karen stormed up the driveway like she owned the pavement. "Don't let him fool you. He's been harassing me since he moved in. That Harley is Tyler's. Jake is just refusing to return it." The officers exchanged a glance that said they'd seen this kind of neighbor dispute before, but Karen wasn't done. She jabbed a finger toward Jake. "He's dangerous. He threatened me when I asked politely for the bike." "The HOA will back me up." Jake crossed his arms. "Officers, I've never threatened her. What I have done is keep every single bogus violation notice she sent me." He gestured toward the folder again. "If you'd like, I can show you." The stack each one signed by her. "This isn't about a stolen bike. It's about harassment." The taller officer looked at Karen. "Ma'am, unless you have proof of ownership, there's nothing to suggest this is your son's motorcycle." Karen's face went red, but she didn't produce any documents. Instead, she muttered something about knowing people in the right places and stormed off toward her house. As the officers turned to leave, Jake knew this wasn't over. Karen's obsession had escalated from petty fines to false police reports. She was playing with fire, and what she didn't know was that Jake had an ace up his sleeve. One phone call to a close friend in the state attorney's office, and this little neighborhood drama was going to turn into something she'd regret for a very long time. The moment the patrol car pulled away, Jake went inside, closed the door, then reached for his phone. He scrolled to a familiar name, Mark Lawson, an old friend from his firefighting days who now worked in the state attorney's office. Mark wasn't just some distant acquaintance. They'd been through life and death situations together, and Jake knew he could trust him. "Mark, I've got a situation," Jake said, explaining everything from Karen's absurd demand for the Harley to the fake HOA violations and the false police report. Mark didn't interrupt, but Jake could almost hear the gears turning on the other end. "This isn't just neighborhood nonsense," Mark finally said. "What she's done could be considered harassment, defamation, abuse of HOA power, and filing a false police report. I'll have my investigators take a look." True to his word, within a week, 2 state investigators arrived in the neighborhood. They didn't come in marked cars, and they didn't make a scene, but their questions were sharp and precise. They interviewed neighbors, requesting copies of any violation letters they'd received. Several residents admitted they'd been targeted by Karen before, but none had pushed back as hard as Jake. When the investigators approached the HOA board, things began to unravel quickly. The board members, most of whom had simply let Karen run the show to avoid her wrath, were shown evidence of her actions. copies of fabricated violation letters, audio recordings from neighbors who'd overheard her bragging about getting rid of Jake, and the official police report she'd filed falsely claiming theft. Karen's confidence began to crumble. She tried shifting the blame, saying the whole board had agreed with her decisions. But the board members denied it instantly. One even admitted they'd been afraid to confront her because of how aggressive she could get. By the end of that week, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Karen was officially removed from her position as president and barred from holding any HOA role in the future. She faced a hefty personal fine for harassment and legal fees. With the threat of criminal charges still looming, Jake didn't gloat. Instead, he parked his Harley right in the driveway the next morning, polished to a blinding shine. As he sipped his coffee, he saw Karen drive past, her face tight and pale. He gave her a small, polite nod.